So yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today for this virtual discussion. My name's Matthew. I'm a member of the Workerist study group that helped organize this. And this is hopefully the first of a number of events that we'll be hosting throughout the summer, looking at the history and the study and the practice of political workerism, or operaismo, and thinking about its continued relevance today and critically assessing that. Tonight's discussion is on the workers' committees of Porto Marghera and environmental workerism, and we're very grateful to be joined by Lorenzo Feltrin, who will focus on the workers' committees of Porto Marghera and their unique ecological contributions to Italian workerist theory. Lorenzo is a researcher who studies the connections between political ecology and workerism, and he's recently translated the Porto Marghera's Workers' 1971 piece, Against Noxiousness, into English. He also has published fascinating articles for Raw Magazine and Theory and Society, which analyze the activists of Porto Marghera and their often overlooked struggle against noxiousness. Lorenzo's work highlights the prominent role that environmentalism played within the Italian 68, even if it's ignored. And I think there's a lot of potent lessons that we can take from critically assessing these events and the ideas behind them. So to kick off the discussion event today, we're going to have a short presentation by Lorenzo on this topic, and then we'll move on to questions and wider discussion. So I'll pass on to you, Lorenzo.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for participating, and thanks to the organizers. I'm going to start straight away by sharing a presentation that I have, so that even if, my English is not super clear, then I'm sure that everybody will have a sense of what I'm saying. So here we go. The presentation is about research I've done on the Porto Marghera Workerist group. So at some point they use the name the Workerist Committee, but they use several different names and acronyms. So this is just a way to basically embrace them all. Yes, it was mentioned in the introduction. I think it's correct to say that this is a relatively little known side of workerism. For sure in the English-speaking world. I remember reading a South Atlantic Quarterly article saying basically that, workerism has never really tackled the ecological side of things, and it could be, interesting for it to start developing it. And so no reference was made to this experience because the protagonists of it were not full-time intellectuals. This production is scattered across a whole variety of materials, from factory flyers, factory bulletins, and the reviews, especially Lavoro Zero and Controlavoro. And so even in Italy, this is sort of a minor strand in the memory of workerism, but it was one of the most important groups, in the history of the late 60s and 70s. So it wasn't like, an irrelevant group of people. And I'm happy to see that Pietro Di Paola, which never met us in the audience, but I know he's done work on the army factory specifically, I think. So that's, there's already work being done on this, hasn't circulated that much in the English-speaking world, especially. So just a few terminological clarifications before moving on. So noxiousness, I wasn't really sure how to translate the Italian word nocività, because literally that's the property of causing harm. just like the English word, I think. But through its use by the Italian labor movement, it came to mean damage to human and non-human life. So it was what is normally called in English health and environment, which reflects a sort of linguistic division between human life and non-human life. And it's damage to human and non-human life caused by production. It's not a specifically workerist concept. There were other people in the labor movement, for example, in the left wing of the CGL, the main union associated to the communist and socialist parties, like Iva Rodone, Giulio Macaccaro, Luigi Mara, and these experiences were later they gather in this association called Medicina Democratica. But the Porto Marghera group had a specific theory of noxiousness, a specifically workerist theory of noxiousness. And then, yes, this work technology nexus. What do I mean by that? I mean by that the co-evolution of technologies and labor processes in capitalism, which is driven, as we know, by intra-capitalist competition and class struggle. So the important thing here is that this co-evolution, the work technology nexus, is shaped by the imperatives of the law of value. And therefore, even if technology and capitalism includes concessions due to class struggle, and so it's not merely functional to capitalist development, it must still guarantee the profitability and task level discipline. And we're going to go back to this issue later in the presentation. So who are these people? Who are the Porto Marghera Workerist group? Here, very brief chronology. Obviously, you can find in the articles a lot more detail. But the group originated in the early 1960s through an encounter between students and intellectuals, mostly based in Padua and Venice. And Antonio Negri was one of the main figures in that. The Padua group was associated to the left wing of the Italian Socialist Party, but quickly exited. And in their attempts to approach factory workers in Marghera, which was the main industrial center of Veneto, this region where Venice is located, they started to meet these workers and technicians disaffected with the line, the Communist Party and the main union, CGL. So by 1967, they had become a proper extra-parliamentary local organization known as Potere Operaio Veneto Emiliano, so not the national Potere Operaio, which appeared in 1969. And the first notable struggle over noxiousness in which the Porto Marghera group was involved took place in 1967 when, and the main struggle was the petrochemical, which was this very large integrated petrochemical complex owned by Monte Edison, in which there was all sorts of toxic and polluting production, which at the time was extremely severe. But I would like to stress that since the beginning, so since 1968, after the major strike wave of the petrochemical workers, it was not just a concern with workers' health, although especially at that time that was the main target, but also the effects of the productive noxiousness on the external environment. So for example, if you take this flyer by Potere Operaio from the 28th November 1968, it says for every month for every square kilometer of Mestre, which is the urban area next to Marghera, 10,000 kilos of powder produced in the Porto Marghera plants fall down. Obviously, the powder comes with gases whose toxic effects are universally recognized. Rates of lung cancer in the population of Mestre and Venice are among the highest in it. A very important character in this theorizing was Augusto Finzi. He was born to a Jewish family in Venice in 1941. He spent part of his childhood in a refugee camp in Switzerland to escape the Holocaust. It's important to note that the German chemical industry, which was the most advanced at the time, had a key and dreadful role in the Shoah, as it is well known. So after receiving a high school diploma in chemistry in 1960, he immediately started working at the age of 19 in petrochemical, never attended university. And he died of cancer in 2004, which is not uncommon among the workers in the chlorovinyl plants where he used to work. So this is very, very short synthesis of the characteristics of the theory of noxiousness produced by the group. The most peculiar and specific feature is this core thesis of capitalist work as inherently noxious. We'll see the details of it. An antagonist transformative approach to capitalist technology, a theorization and practice of a connection between workplace and community struggles, and this reinterpretation of self-valorization as a quantitative and qualitative platforms encompassing the environment. So, on the first point, there is here the key theorist, Mario Tronti. All of you, I'm guessing, know him from Strategy of Refusal, the Refusal of Work. Just to quote the guy himself, by refusal of work, it was meant a working class struggle against work, a struggle of the worker against himself as worker, labor power's refusal to become labor. So in this conception, class struggle is not understood as the affirmation of work as a positive value, but as negation of it, because capitalist work is the production of capital and thus the reproduction of a society of exploitation. So taking these theoretical propositions into the lived experience of the workers in Porto Marghera, which were characterized by high levels of health and safety hazards, of toxicities, of silicosis, and other diseases. This resulted in the thesis that capitalist work is inherently noxious. And this is because capitalist work reflects the priority of profit over the satisfaction of needs, and so the production of value over the reproduction of life. In their paper Against Noxiousness that was mentioned in introduction, they repropose this distinction that had been done by other people in the labor movement as well between tangible and organizational noxiousness. And they say that on the one hand, there is tangible noxiousness like smoke, powder, hazards, explosions, accidents, and that can be to some extent resolved within capitalism. But then you have the capitalist organization of work, which has its own impact on the health and well-being of the worker, and on the outside, the imperative for endless growth that has an impact on the environment, and that's not possible. It is not possible to solve it within capitalism. So in this conception, the critique that was done of the union line at the time was that by demanding technical ameliorations to be negotiated by bipartite commissions, they were only addressing the tangible noxiousness, but they were not going at the core of the problem. So the priority of value production, life production. This, of course, was the critique by the workers. The union itself probably would not agree. The reduction of work time was thus the commanded tactic to transform the fight for survival in the factory, the struggle for human liberation from capitalist work. So the idea was by gaining wage hikes and being able to spend less hours in the factory, we also protect ourselves from the inherent noxiousness of capitalist work. So this is a bit of a longish quote from the opening of the Against Noxiousness article. It's worth it. So when facing the problem of noxiousness in the factory, it is necessary to immediately distinguish between one form of noxiousness, as it is traditionally understood, linked to the work environment, toxic substances, smokes, powders, noise, so what have been called intangible noxiousness, from the one linked more generally to the capitalist organization of work. No doubt, ultimately, the second type of noxiousness has a deeper impact on the worker's psychophysical balance. It makes him an alienated entity. Obviously, the language they use was gendered since, well, it's a characteristic of Italian, but this thing of trying to use non-gender language was not part of the political movement at the time, unfortunately. A piece of the productivist machine completely detached from the end of his work, subject to the continuous usury that brings upon him an inhuman use of his labor power, as it is the capitalist one, driven exclusively by the profits of the ruling class. Well, the picture is one of the most iconic actions by the group, in which 1973, there was this staging of a crucifixion of a worker wearing a gas mask because of the repeated leaks of phosgene, which is this highly toxic gas that had been used in World War I and in the Italian colonial wars as well. The inspector of labor had made this order saying that all the workers had to have a gas mask within reach because of the gas leaks, which meant that it wasn't necessary to fix the gas leaks by the PPP, the mask, what was the commanded solution. So this symbolized more generally this idea that the workers were not willing to sacrifice their health and lives on the altar of capitalist development. Another interesting part, which I'm not able to address fully here, is the use of vinyl chloride monomer in the production process. It is a carcinogenic substance, an intermediate substance in the production of PVC, polyvinyl chloride, which turned out is carcinogenic. And then there was in the 90s and 2000s a big trial against the managers of Mount Edison and then Eni, because we were accused of having this secrecy pact with the American and European multinationals in order to keep these secret or delay the news of the carcinogenic nature of the product. There's an interesting PhD thesis on vinyl chloride monomer in the UK, and it finishes by saying that while in the US and in Italy there were some trials over it, in the UK they basically managed to keep it quiet. Concerning the critique of capitalist technology, here the key text, as opposed to Tronti, is Panzeri, the capitalist use of machinery. I'm guessing many of you will be familiar with it. But it is this idea that there are many possible trajectories of technological development. So it's not that technological development is objective and universal and unavoidable process of rationalization. And the trajectory of technological development that actually takes place embodies the struggles and the balance of power in place. And in a capitalist society, as said before, has to be compatible with the accumulation of value. So the chain, the production line in Ford's factory is a typical example of this, of a technology that is conceived to control the labor process, to place the control of the labor process within machines rather than within a process controlled by the workers. So this resulted in an antagonist transformative approach to technology, a variety of what Finberg, this American theorist of critical technology studies, called a critical approach to technology, which is different from both the instrumentalist view that says that technology is just a neutral tool to achieve some ends, and therefore there is no good or bad technology, which is good or bad ends. And to the essentialist view, it's different from the essentialist view that says that all technology is inherently problematic, irrespective of the social relations in which it is conceived. So here's two quotes to symbolize this. This is from '68, and talking about the sanitation, basically the correction of noxiousness in the labor process. They say, yes, it is necessary to also make some technical modifications to the production cycle, but maybe a new race of engineers is required to build machines that will not destroy health and enormously increase profits. So the machines themselves, and the way that they're built, incorporated this priority of profit. And secondly, the bosses are still using automation in an anti-worker function. The introduction of new machines and computers does not lead to a decrease in working hours, but to an increase in the profits. So this is an idea of the refusal of work, which is basically different from the accelerationist idea that you have to demand more automation as such, or I guess, you know, the way accelerationism is usually read. Yeah, it's interesting to see how they never really said much as workerism in general about how the society of the future would look like. And the only hints of it that you have is in the illustrations, especially in Lavoro Zero, in which, for example, they took this illustration from Möbius, who's, I didn't know him, but he's a comics illustrator from France. Used to be left-wing, apparently. I don't know much about him. If anybody does, I'd be interested. In which there's sort of this idea of a different technology, basically, which combines pre-capitalist and futuristic elements. Move to the third point. There's this idea of a connection, necessary connection between workplace struggles and reproduction and community struggles. So here it is very clear the influence of feminism on the point of production. There's a double L, which shouldn't be there, forgive me. Well, on the point of reproduction as a terrain of struggle. So here the influence of the what is called in English autonomous feminism is clear. So, for example, Maria Rosa della Costa used to go a lot in Porto Marghera for these leafleting drives by Potere Operaio, as also in the collection of writings that is by Camille Barbagallo is very well explained. There's a feminist split from Potere Operaio in 1971, from which the group Lotta Femminista Feminist Struggle is born, which would lead to the creation of the Committee for Wages for Housework, together with Selma James and sort of more international movement. And in Lavoro Zero, you find some articles by the campaign as well. So by reproduction, for those who are not familiar, I guess most will be, but we mean non-directly commodified creation and maintenance of labor power. This was initially done on the issue of inflation, and so struggles in the neighborhood against rising prices, so pickets outside supermarkets, or self-reduction of energy bills. But concerning struggles over noxiousness, the most interesting example is the collective struggle against noxious productions, just this attempt to link the workplace struggles against noxiousness with community struggles over the pollution produced by the factories. And it's kind of interesting because it's really a double inversion. So on the one hand, today you normally have fence-line communities that are infuriated about the pollution coming from, say, refineries, petrochemical factories, any sort of highly polluting industrial complex, while the workers inside of the factory are mainly worried about their jobs, and therefore there is this sort of split between workers and community. While in this case, like in many other cases of working class environmentalism, it was the workers themselves employed in the polluting factories that were going out to the population and try to sensitize them in a time in which there wasn't much awareness about pollution. And the second inversion is some sort of an inversion of the workers' inquiry method. So back in the mid-1960s, these external intellectuals, students would approach the workers and encourage them to produce this knowledge, these reports on the class composition and the labor process of their workplaces. In this case, it was these guys that were employed in the factories, so these internal workers that would go to the outside, especially to the youths and the women in the neighborhood, and encourage them to produce knowledge and reports of how the factories, the noxiousness from the factories, was affecting their conditions of reproduction. It now reached mass mobilization stage, also because it was created in 1977, and the situation soon began to decline. But then in the 90s, and no, especially in the 2000s, Marghera, there's been the struggle over pollution from the factory, in which there's been mass mobilization in the neighborhood, but then in the factory, the workers didn't have the same influence as before. So as an example of the feminist influences on Lavoro Zero, there's this article that says we need to break to our advantage the ghettos, the family, neighborhood, parish, village, through which capital has historically poor society. We can interpret along these lines the occupations of luxury houses, the demand for schools at the service of the communities, the demand for control on environment and health against noxiousness, and the demand for wages for housework. This is Marghera, by the way, the neighborhood. And this is the review of the local committee of wages for housework, L'Operaio della Casa, so the house workers. And finally, the fourth point is this idea of self-valorization as linked to environmental demands. Here, there's this historical evolution in the politics of the group, basically, in which in the strike wave of 1968 and 1969, the watchword was more money, less work, as it is known in the history of workerism, with the idea that the recipe again to turn the struggle against noxiousness and a revolutionary struggle was the struggle against work to reduce the work week up to a breaking point, basically. But then once it became clear that this breaking point was not going to be reached anytime soon, this was integrated with qualitative demands towards a decommodified production for a deep transformation of the production process, not just in the how, but also the how much and the what to produce. So there are all these articles on energy production criticizing the switch from oil and gas to nuclear energy and proposing instead already the diffuse production of energy from renewable sources. This critique of the increase of production of plastics. So here's the relevant quote. Today, we need to challenge the organization of work, but not just its levels and parameters, but also the fundamental choices that make us produce commodities, not wealth, useless things made only to generate profits. What, how, and how much to produce must be our parameters of struggle. So these workers are working in petrochemical factories producing plastic, and plastic is one of the most glaring examples of the irrationality of capitalist production, in which you basically take a plastic bag, use it for 5 minutes, and then it stays into the environment for hundreds of years. And they were criticizing that from within the factory. So there's this interesting evolution in which the quantitative demands of the 60s and early 70s were a way to criticize those aspects of qualitative platforms that were liable to be co-opted into co-management schemes, or if you see the trajectory of Italian cooperatives become basically a scheme for cheap labor today. So it is important to note that the new qualitative demands were not meant to substitute the quantitative ones, but they were put forward together in order to be effective, both on the sides of trying to reach a breaking point of of redistribution, basically, that makes the reproduction of the system unsustainable, but at the same time having this idea of a qualitative change in production that will make it sustainable, environmentally sustainable. So I'm gonna stop here. I think that's enough for the moment. Obviously, I'm looking forward to questions and debate. This is just to say that although the group ceased to be active in 1980, the story is not finished, and so you had in the 80s and 90s a series of environmental struggles in Marghera and Venice linked to the factories, and now you can see this legacy also in the post-workerist social centers participations, the climate strikes, for instance, in Veneto. And so there's much to be discussed also in relation to the political situation today. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. That was really useful, really interesting. I think how you sort of clarified how this idea of noxiousness is something that goes sort of beyond the sphere of production, and also is intimately related to sort of the sphere of reproduction and the links between self-valorization and environmentalism. So thank you for that presentation. And before we move on to sort of open discussion and people saying sort of how maybe this links to struggles today or asking any questions they may have, I just wanted to ask one question, sort of relating to this, I guess, to the most poignant topic of the moment, coronavirus, and think about how sort of considering the massive and dense concentration of workers in factories and warehouses and global supply chains today, and the fact that makes it necessary to sort of relate the militant stance against noxiousness to the modern workplace that is now affected by coronavirus. I was wondering, sort of, in your opinion, what it would mean to be against noxiousness in these sectors today, where millions of workers sort of face the horrible existential choice between increased exposure to the virus and illness and death, or losing their job on the other hand. So any sort of thoughts you have on this?
Yes, thanks for the question. It's you know, from this perspective, but this is, I think, agreed across strands of Marxist thinking. You cannot separate the contemporary coronavirus pandemic from the capitalist mode of production, in the sense of the general environmental ecological crisis has been engendered by this model of continuous endless growth, has caused a host of environmental problems, including deforestation, that make pandemics more likely. And of course, the transmission of the virus is facilitated by a highly interconnected world. And finally, the inequalities that exist in society make some social groups more vulnerable to the spread of the virus. So this has very much been analyzed over the last 1 year and a half. In terms of the workplace, so there was in Marghera at the time these tactic regarding the plants where you had the units, where you had accidents and hazards, that was called stop, sanitize, and restart. And this was not just the Workerist group, it was also the factory council that was mainly controlled by the unions. And so the idea was, if there is significant health hazard, or if there is an accident, everybody stops working. They demand that certain changes are made to the unit, and in the meantime, they have to be paid regardless of whether they can work or not for the time that the units are modified. And then work can go on. If the units cannot be fixed, then they need to be shut down. So this is still relevant, and it's been happening, at least, I mean, I'm more familiar with the logistics sector in Italy because that's the sector where there's been most significant struggles lately. So there were many instances in the early phases of the pandemic in which if it was impossible because of the high rhythms, a high pace of work, to keep a reasonable level of physical distancing, then the workers would stop and demand PPE, demanded the process to slow down. But like we're seeing on a more general level, these anti-COVID measures have been to some extent also instrumentalized afterwards to prevent workers from organizing. There's been an attempted ban on strikes in here, which has been called back. And this is shown very well, I think, in these, I thought, very cool workers' inquiry published on Notes from Below on this Amazon warehouse in Birmingham, in which, yeah, there's these social distancing Nazis rather than sort of caring about slowing down the work process to make it easier for workers to keep safe. They just keep telling people off for basically moving too close to each other, which is, you know, part of things that you need to make your work or bearable. And as I was saying before, now there's going to be G20 of finance in Venice in July, and you know, things are opening up in here because people are getting vaccinated. But then they say for the week of the G20, there will be a lockdown just in Venice, just for the time of the G20, which is clearly instrumental, right? So this aspect. But I also wanted to say that in a way you could read the pandemic as a global manifestation of the jobs versus environment dilemma. So this idea that, well, in capitalism, obviously those who live by the wage need to have jobs in order to live. And capitalism only creates jobs when there is economic growth, and then economic growth has these severe environmental consequences that become more and more unsustainable over time. So in a way, why usually this idea of the jobs versus environment dilemma is normally applied just to large-scale noxious factories is a characteristic of capitalism as a whole. So this is in line with this idea of capitalist work being inherently noxious. So I think on a deeper level, what needs to be done is severing the link between work, capitalist work, and workers' reproduction. Easier said than done. But basically by emphasizing working class interests and reproductive needs, like the need for a healthy ecology, as the material basis for a working class environmentalism, while the link between workers' reproduction and capitalist work is the material basis of working class denialism. So, you know, working class community is voting for Trump because he will increase fracking and coal extraction and all that in order to keep the economy growing and jobs. So a platform today would be something towards shorter hours, so shortening the working week, radical wealth redistribution in order to make these socially sustainable, and deep qualitative changes of production in a sustainable direction, moving, well, with a strategic aim to move towards non-commodified production and thus standards of capitalism. So I think what can be done in the here and now is struggles to connect workplace and community struggles, demanding redistribution to wage and welfare, shorter hours, and transformations of production in a sustainable direction where possible.
Amazing. Thank you for the answer. I think now we're going to open the floor to a more general discussion. So if anyone has any questions for Lorenzo or any comments or thoughts they want to share on sort of this topic and any links they themselves have made, please do just put the raise hand function up on Zoom, or comment in the chat, and I can tell you to go and share your thoughts. And if not, I can just keep questioning Lorenzo, but maybe it'll be a bit nicer if we have a more sort of open discussion. So yeah, I'll give people a moment to have a little think and see if they have anything to say. I mean, I guess if not, in the meantime,
there was a question in the chat. I guess I partially addressed at some point, but yeah, it's worth going more into depth. So the early wave of community struggles were about inflation mainly, because after the hot autumn of 1969, massive strike wave, there were massive wage increases, and the beginning of a reform of the welfare system that expanded it, and therefore these wage increases were being recuperated to price increases. So the idea was that in order to exit from basically this loss of what was achieved in the workplace in the sphere of circulation, you had to put up community struggles against the rise of the cost of living. And this took place by picketing supermarkets and demanding that certain goods have political prices, by occupying houses, and at some point this phenomenon took very large proportions in Marghera, Mestre, and some parts of Venice. And by this idea of self-reduction, particularly of energy bills, it was of course the time in 1973 of the so-called oil crisis, and therefore there was this massive increase in the cost of energy. And this took mass proportions as well. So you had apparently thousands of bills that had been self-reduced. As I say, the noxiousness aspect of these struggles arrived later on in '97 with the collective of struggle against noxious productions. And here there were these public assemblies and local school at the Massari Institute, and these basically agitation and propaganda in the neighborhoods concerning the noxiousness of the factories, these inquiries, for example, on the Macro-Denta neighborhood, on the effects of pollution. But it never really became a mass movement in the neighborhoods at the time, as I said. So it didn't become so later on in the 2000s, but then by that time that took more the shape of a typical Festa community struggle in which the workers were on the side of keeping production in place, and they wanted to shut down the place, although there were different proposals to address the needs of the two that never really managed to gain the upper hand, basically. And also, just to connect these with the question from before, so it's interesting, basically, to see what's going on now, since we've been talking about Amazon in the last, in the last almost 1 year I've been in Italy. And so we've been trying to connect community struggles with struggles in the logistics sector, particularly related to Amazon. It's been obviously massively increasing due to the pandemic and the fact that people were unable to go out to do their shopping. And so Amazon has been planning many new warehouses in the region, in Veneto. Some of them include massive cementification of green areas of land, and an increase in traffic once they will be built. So there's been this committee against the construction of a massive Amazon warehouse. And at the same time, we've been trying to analyze the production process in Amazon. It's clearly worse than the conditions that have been conquered by the struggles of the logistics workers in the last 10 years in Italy. And therefore, this is kind of an occasion because different from, say, the construction of a refinery in a given place where the work conditions will probably be relatively good. In Amazon, there's a more direct possibility to make a link between these environmental struggles against the loss of green land and against air pollution, with logistics sector struggles in the workplace against the Amazonification of the logistics work process. So that's something. I mean, it's as we need to be aware of. We're in a very small town. I'm from Treviso, 8,000 people, so I wouldn't say that it reached mass proportions, but it's an attempt to go in that direction.
Awesome. I think Gifford wants to ask a question, so feel free to go, Gifford.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, because the workers at Porto Marghera were able to shut down production in some cases because it was just toxic. Right now, we know fossil fuels are adding to greenhouse gases and global warming and things like that. Now, I think the demands of the workers that you're talking about could be applied to right now, like refinery workers. And there's been talks about decommissioning refineries, but it's always top down. It's always in negotiations with the state. Have you heard of any examples anywhere of from the bottom up, a working class response to things like refineries, where workers themselves who are skilled know how to shut it down? Maybe there's no examples, but I think everything you've talked about points in that direction of how it should be a working class based movement to move towards a different way of producing things like energy. So I just wondered if you have any other examples.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, it's very crucial today, but it also shows how it's pretty hard, especially regarding the sector of the oil and gas sector and refineries. So there is a refinery in Porto Marghera, which was not integrated with the petrochemical complex, now integrated with it. And yeah, it wasn't known to have a history of militant struggles by the workers. But then at some point, Eni, which is the Italian oil and gas company, decided to shut it down. There was a struggle by the workers to keep it open. And eventually this resulted in it remaining open and being converted into a biorefinery, which was presented as being greener, but then if you look at it, more closely, it mainly used palm oil from Indonesia and Malaysia, which obviously comes with land grabbing, deforestation. So it's a way basically of pushing the noxiousness in the global south. So it's a highly problematic sector because on the one hand, wages and conditions are relatively favorable as opposed to other sectors. So it's if you try to convince those workers that actually have the power to shut them down, that it is in their interest, it surely is in their interest as part of the broader working class with an interest in preserving the conditions of reproduction of humanity on the planet. But it's not in their immediate interest because there isn't the political power at the minute to guarantee that the income of those workers will be protected, which poses a dilemma because obviously, you can't stop campaigning on fossil fuels because you don't have a majority of the refinery oil and gas workers with you. Which is why I think basically income protection schemes that are independent of one's employment would be a way to cushion the effects of these types of transformations. So that's, a broader political change that I think could make it easier for the workers to be engaged in these types of struggles. So that could be a possible direction in which to move. I know the situation in Grangemouth, for instance, in which you had a massive decline of the work conditions after Ineos took over. But I don't think there's, that led to any will by the workers to shut down the refinery. Actually, that's what Jim Ratcliffe did. He wanted to shut it down, and that's how he gained the upper hand in the struggle. But yeah, thanks for the question. Hope I was somehow helpful.
We'll move to you, Noah, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah. Hey, Lorenzo. I was going to ask, one of the sort of most blatant examples in the UK at the minute of somewhere where this could be applicable is Heathrow, where there's obviously the proposals of the third runway. There's sort of community resistance to it. But obviously, like the institutions of organised labour, particularly like the Union Unite, are like firmly behind it. Similarly with HS2, you have what's everyone's favourite union? What's it called? Anyway, the railway union. I can't remember. Anyway, the railway union are backing like strongly and sort of like dogmatically in favour of these projects, obviously in the interests of maintaining workers. RNT, thank you, Matt, and everybody else. In the interest of retaining jobs and sort of like, all these sort of like classic talking points. I was wondering what sort of intervention in situations like this could be made on a class level, by workers themselves, rather than, I guess that's been a bit harsh, like these sort of tree occupations in the proposed routes and stuff like that, things like Great Heathrow or the HS2 camps. What historical examples are there of workers linking up with sort of these sorts of struggles and like effectively pushing like an environmentalist line from a class line sort of thing? Cheers. Hope you're well.
It's great to see you, man. It's been a while, although online is not the same. And thanks for the question. So again, I don't think the jobs versus environment dilemma is a false dilemma, right? So those workers in those sectors that have a particularly high environmental impact are facing basically a leap in the dark when you're demanding that a project is cancelled or a refinery is shut down. At the same time, our political proposition is that fossil fuels are not in the broader working class interest, right? Or the construction of new highways and things like that. So this has to be addressed on a number of levels. As on a more general level, as I said, political platforms for radical wealth redistribution, and again, taxing Amazon, for instance, would be a way to start. Sorry, I mean, my head is focused on that because that's what I'm doing at the minute. And plan changes in the way things are done, and a shorter working week. And then as you go down, when you analyze a localized work environmental conflict, first of all, I think working class struggles should not be only seen as struggles at the point of production, but also struggles at the point of reproduction. So if you check the geography of the location of highly noxious plants, so refineries, petrochemical complexes, steel mills that use metals that are highly polluting, they are located by working class neighborhoods, obviously in an extended notion of the working class as people being dispossessed from significant control and ownership of means of production. So not just factory workers, but people that have to sell their labor power in order to live. So an example, for example, sort of by now sadly a textbook example, Scans Rally, the United States. So it's this area in Louisiana that is located on ex-slave plantations, in which then the land was sold to the petrochemical companies, and located by all these communities, mainly composed of descendants of slaves. So, you know, in your typical media or common sense way, you have on the one hand workers, on the other hand racialized subjects, which are not analyzed whatsoever from a class perspective. But then those people are actually working class and struggling at the point of reproduction for their interest in healthy ecology, right? So these are still working class interventions. They're not workplace-centered working class interventions, at least in the way I see it. For what concerns the struggles at the point of production, so workplace struggles, you have in Against Rally this example in which at some point multinational, I forgot which one was it, wanted to dismiss a number of workers, and for the others there was a decline in terms and conditions, and at that juncture it was possible to create an alliance between those unionized workers and communities, in which there was a platform that combined environmental and workplace demands. That was quite specific, but it happened. On the other hand, you always have to put forward, in my opinion, a proposal that says, even if those factories have to shut down, the income of the workers must be protected. There has to be what in the United States is called just transition. Now, you know, the concept has been criticized, and it's been proposed that it's called transformation, which makes it less reactive. But in any case, you know, even if you can't really expect that those workers that are facing high risk will be behind you in that struggle, even if the struggle is correct, so to speak, you always have to underline the fact that you're not against the workers, and that you're not blaming them, and that their income and source of livelihood must be protected, because otherwise you play to the hand of this dividing game in which working class communities are divided from workers in the workplace. So doesn't always, obviously you can't expect these to magically work, otherwise everybody will have adopted it and won, but you have to keep that option open in order for the struggle to be sustainable in a broader perspective. That's the way I see it.
And yeah, Dante, you can go for it.
Hi, cheers, Lorenzo. So I just wanted to ask, perhaps this is too broad, but a lot of the discussion we've been having is fairly localized. So Porto Marghera obviously was specific resistance to the petrochemical plant there, and then some of the examples you've been giving are about localized communities struggling within the kind of environmental and ecological space they inhabit as a community. But obviously thinking through noxiousness and how it relates to strategy of refusal appropriate today, we have to think about capitalism as an international and as a global system, as a expanding totality. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about if you have any thoughts on how we can think through this question as a question of internationalism and working class internationalism, of struggle and refusal on a global level across, production chains, and as a potential way in which workers can come together on a global level, not just on a communal level, on a localized community.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Again, very important. I think it's fair to say that an analysis of what is today called the global south and its relationship to what is today is called the global north was not the strongest point of Workerist theory in general, and of the Porto Marghera Workerist group in particular. So you'll find in their materials, declaration of solidarity with Vietnam, Palestine, Chile, and so on, but not a very deep theorization. Also, the D used this autonomous feminist theorization of ways of the world unite, as Selma James wrote in an article. So this idea that, like they proposed, that through these universal political wage, as it was called at the time, you had to unite the unemployed with the wage workers. In the same way, you could use that to sort of unify those workers in wage production and those workers that are working in unwaged situations, which of course applies to a lot of informal workers in the global south. But yes, that wasn't like their main focus, although in my research, former research on precarious workers and trade unions in Morocco and Tunisia, I did use this autonomous feminist framework. Obviously, noxiousness is unevenly distributed globally, and we can see it now with COVID vaccines being basically held in the global north at the minute. And my current research project, which I mean is this historical comparison of history of work environment contradictions, struggles in Porto Marghera with Quintero in Chile. So that's obviously, you know, another localized point, but it's in the global south, and I hope that this could give me a way to think about noxiousness on a more global level. But this is work in progress. An idea that I had by reading the South American environmentalist literature is this indigenous concept of the buen vivir, so the good living, as a sort of non-noxious way of life and producing, and whether this could be sort of put in relation with their environmentalist interpretation of self-organization in the workerist tradition. But as I say, this is work in progress. Another sort of global way of seeing this is in other writing. I use this concept of noxious deindustrialization, which I'm still testing. And that's about how through automation and slow growth, you have these the industrialization of employment. So industrial output keeps growing, but the share of industrial workers in the world is apparently declining. So, for example, Aaron Bannon has just written a book about it. But at the same time, the noxiousness of the process is not declining in many respects. So in some of them, yes, there's this improving of technologies that leads to less toxins being released. But if you look at, for example, greenhouse gases, which is kind of a massive problem, while at some point the share of industrial employment starts declining with the precarization that comes with it, the greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. So this is what I mean by global noxious deindustrialization, right? You have a deindustrialization of employment, and at the same time, the ecological crisis continues. That's the way of seeing it, and also the way the noxiousness hits different populations is differentially, depending also on global south relationships. So now you have what are called climate migrants, which is a typical example of a surplus population created by this process of automation and slow growth that at the same time are impacted upon by noxiousness, which is very dystopic, but it seems to be what's happening.
I think Andy wants to come in with something on this topic, so please go ahead, Andy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think on the question of internationalism, yeah, I mean, like lots of other people who were involved in struggles in the 60s and 70s, you know, Italian workers and people identified with Italian workerism were certainly internationalists on a theoretical level. They were always making proclamations about solidarity with things going on in other countries. But I think, we have to remember that they really didn't have much of an idea about what was happening in other countries. And I'm not just talking about, on the other side of the world. I mean, even between Italy and France, there was almost no communications. I remember of an old militant in factories in France saying that, he was involved in all kinds of strikes at that time, but he had no idea what was happening in Italy. It's only the other side of the Alps, for God's sake. So I think there was very little concrete kind of understanding of struggles in different countries, although there was a circulation of struggles, of course, as we know, all around the world. And I think, and so, of course, one of the ways that movement of struggle, particularly in Italy, was crushed was simply by workers, simply by the bosses moving production from Italy to other parts of the world, and thus breaking up these big concentrations of workers. And so, and I think if you want to look at things from a positive point of view, we have to say that it's now much more common for people to work for, not just to work for big multinational companies, but to actually have more understanding of what's happening in other parts of the world, to be able to directly communicate using modern technology, which simply wasn't possible in those days. And I think quite often, when people did express this abstract solidarity, it was obviously quite naive. You had people for example, you had students going around identifying with the Cultural Revolution in China. I think looking back on that, you think, oh my God, how could they be so stupid? But they had no fucking idea what was going on in China. Whereas today we do understand about the class struggle in China, for example.
Yeah, and I suppose with that, with sort of the information that we have available to us now and new forms of communication, that opens up new possibilities for terrains of sort of internationalist struggle. But yeah, I'll let Nelly come in with what you want to say.
Hey, sorry, it's Sean, but I put the wrong name up there, or a fake name for the emails. But anyway, sorry. Hi, Lorenzo. So I was just going to ask a bit about I guess like what you were sort of saying about or the question from Gifford about kind of like other examples, and I kind of feel like we're approaching a time where there's some things like some pipelines aren't getting insurance, and here and there'll be projects that have to be closed because they're just not profitable anymore as we get more renewables coming on board. So I think like probably what will happen in terms of like where the kind of industry goes, there'll just be like a certain place where it gets shut down, and then like, and it won't be like the job market might be okay for some of those people to go and work in another like oil refinery or there's all sorts of examples of these industries. But I just wonder like how we can take this idea of like workers' inquiry and organizing and kind of integrate it with the kind of things like Lucas Plan, which was about the workers like pre-developing plans for like when which was in the Midlands in the UK, there was an auto industry was like saying we're going to shut down, and they're saying like we could build these trams instead. But I kind of feel like those sorts of things are really difficult. I know I'm involved in the cooperative movement in the UK, and I know there's like a solid fund which has got like 200 grand in it for like worker buyouts, but that's like nowhere near enough for some of these kind of industries which they'll have to close as part of a transition. So it's kind of like that forward thinking on the part of a movement is maybe the type of internationalism that we need to be thinking about, if that makes any sense. Like, what do we do with those workers or like, how can we support them to do good things instead? I don't know. So a bit of a like broader perspective rather than like just one place. Sorry, that wasn't a question. It was more of a statement to provoke.
I mean, I can speak to that and hopefully the comment before as well. And also there's a question in the chat about they were more about making demands on government or companies building prefigurative counterpower. Yeah, there were definitely more on the side of counterpower, although that didn't exclude making demands on the state and the companies. So, for example, when in the massive strike of 1968, the main demand was 5,000 liras, which was obviously the Italian currency of the time, for everybody. There was obviously a demand on the company that the company had to agree with or not. You know, the main idea was that of egalitarianism. So rather than asking a percentage increase that would end up increasing distance in the wages, in the wage dispersion of the workforce, asking the same thing for everyone. So that would be irrespective of the ranking of the worker in the organization of work. And this is similar today in the sense that I think, you know, this should be this construction of counterpower, which could be through workplace organizing, social centers, all that. But this doesn't exclude making demands on the state and the companies. I don't think they were prefigurative at all, in the sense that they had this idea that organizing had to be effective, whatever works, we do it. So there's these article from 1970 in which they say basically the form of organization is whatever works, and it doesn't have to reflect any type of society that somebody has in mind. This is like textual, more or less. But then, of course, you had, you know, like Workerism is a broad tradition in which you have a lot of different positions, right? Yeah, right, okay, but they still made demands, right? In terms of like, if you demand a wage hikes. By the way, I'm trying to edit a new version of the book by Gianni, so I'm talking to him quite a lot. I'll keep you updated on it, and hopefully digitalizing. I mean, I digitalized the Lavoro Zero and Contro Lavoro, and hopefully we're gonna put it online soon together with Gianni's book. So I'll keep you updated on that. Regarding what Sean was saying, talking about pipelines, there's something we didn't talk about. There's this interesting thing in which the first petrochemical was started operating in 1951, and then in 1970 they built the second petrochemical, which is based on this pipeline network, the ethylene cracker, and then the pipeline network that took some of the stuff from Marghera to Ferrara and Ravenna, and that was, you know, interpreted as a sort of political restructuring response to the struggles of '68, in which the pipeline was used as a way to keep the benefits of the integration of production on a grand scale, but at the same time not having all those workers concentrated in the same place in Marghera, but having them dispersed in a whole integrated petrochemical area with several hundreds of kilometers away. And now that the last bit of the petrochemical, which is the ethylene cracker, which is connected to this pipeline network to other petrochemical complexes of Italy, is due to be shut down next year, apparently. Precisely, this is motivated with the ecological transition, which is in the recovery plan of the Italian government post-pandemic, which doesn't sound very credible, since the owner of the ethylene cracker is now Eni, which is the Italian oil and gas company that has already in its plans a lot of new investments in fossil fuel extraction. And obviously, it seems like the real reason is that the pipes, the plant, they are over 50 years old, so they're not economically viable anymore. But I guess I agree with your suggestion that this process of decommissioning of certain plants and fossil fuel extraction infrastructure could create the occasion to basically offer to those workers platforms of struggle to protect their income in a way that, yes, goes into the direction of also trying to figure out what, how, and how much to produce. So we should definitely keep an eye on that, I think. And regarding the comments about unions, I think it really depends on a case-by-case basis what the sort of opportunity structure is to organize with or without a union. That's personally what I've seen throughout my different experiences, but that's my own opinion.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you everyone for coming. I think we may have room for one more question, but if not, we'll start to wrap up. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully this will be the first event of a series of monthly events throughout the summer. We'll hopefully have a schedule up soon, so follow us on Pagliacci Rossi on Facebook and Twitter for more. We also, if anyone has sort of wants to run an event on something or has knowledge on something which they would want to discuss, but don't have a platform to do that, related around these topics of operaismo and its intersections, please please get in touch, and we'll be happy to assist with that and give you a platform to do that and help the organizing. But yeah, let's take these discussions back outside this event, think more about how we can incorporate them into our struggles today and how we struggle, and where. And yeah, hopefully see you all soon, and see you all in the future. And I will just send our email into the chat now, Gifford, for you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening and being here and organizing it. It was a massive pleasure, and yeah, hope to see you soon somehow.
Do you want to stop recording, Ollie? I mean, this is